Good evening, and welcome to the Visiting Writers Seminar at Oklahoma Baptist University. I'm Ben Myers, a professor in the English department and creative writing major at OBU. This is the 5th year of the Visiting Writers program, and I'm delighted to see you all here. Welcome also to those watching us via the live stream at home. This series was founded with the ambition of bringing to campus poets and writers of national significance in order to bring our students into contact with the living experience of contemporary literature, and in order to bring the OBU literary community into meaningful dialogue with the larger literary world. Without the support of university administrators, staff, and faculty, as well as community members, this event could not have taken place. In your program, you will find the names of many people who have helped us to make this event possible. We are particularly grateful to those who have supported this event with their generous financial contributions. On the back of your program, you will find some of the names of these supporters. Again, we say thank you for believing in what we do. Thank you for understanding that appreciation of the written word improves the quality of life for all of us. Thank you for caring about beauty. We are very excited tonight to offer books for sale. So if you want to pick up a copy of one of Ron Hansen's books, he will be signing books during the reception immediately after the reading. So I can't think of a better place to be. You can buy books, eat food, and hang out with friends. So seems like paradise to me. One last note regarding paradise before we get on with it. Please take out your cell phone, and if you are not willing to throw it out the window, at least put it on silent for the duration of the reading, as I am now confident that I have done. And now I'd like to introduce my esteemed colleague, Brent Newsom, who will introduce our reader for this evening.
Thank you. We've been looking forward to this evening for a very long time, and so we're delighted that you have all joined us. Accolades in a writer's biographical note are a bit like sprigs of parsley on the plate at any steakhouse a step above the Golden Corral. They're almost always present and never important. I say this not to diminish the many awards for which tonight's visiting writer has been recognized. There actually is cultural importance to, say, being named a finalist for the National Book Award, the National Book Critics Circle Award, or the Faulkner Award twice. My point is that such awards are not what draw us to an author's work, or at least not what draw us back to an author's work. We come to the steakhouse not for the parsley, but for the ribeye. And so we have come tonight to partake of the words and work of Ron Hansen, whose 2 short story collections, many essays, and 9 novels, several of which are for sale tonight, are indeed a feast for the hungry reader. Mr. Hansen writes with wit, sensitivity, and great vividness of characters who somehow seem immediately recognizable on the page, but who turn out to be surprising and endlessly complex. His novel, Atticus, for example, follows a simple Colorado rancher to Mexico to claim the body of his wayward and recently murdered son. In Mariette and Ecstasy, a young postulate's passionate devotion to Christ sends the sisters of her convent into turmoil. In the historical westerns, Desperados, The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, and The Kid, Mr. Hansen peels back our popular myths of outlaws on horseback to reveal the wonder and the wounds at their cores. But neither do these novels sacrifice plot on the altar of character. Make no mistake, these novels are page-turners. In addition to being a great storyteller, Mr. Hansen is a prose stylist of the first rank, and his stylistic virtuosity is matched by the depth of his religious vision. He understands, to borrow a phrase from Gregory Wolfe, that our task in life is not to look away from the sin-scarred creation and dwell on an ideal world, but to look for grace and redemption in the midst of the mess we've made. To give but one example of how such redemption enters Mr. Hansen's sin-scarred narrative worlds, consider his description in The Kid of the titular Billy's thoughts as he lay dying from Sheriff Pat Garrett's gunshot. With each quitting of an organ or process, there came a greater liberation, an aliveness, an awareness of having never been so real. Seeing himself on the floor and the chaotic concern around him, he felt affection for all of them, felt pity for who he used to be, but he was overwhelmed by his new fluidity and increase, his ever greater sense of wonderful love and limitlessness, of having now what he'd always wanted but couldn't ever name. We are delighted to have a writer of such vision at OBU for the 2019 Visiting Writer Seminars. Now, without further delay, please help me welcome Ron Hansen.
Thank you, Brent. That was terrific, and thank you all for coming here. I'm really honored to be in your presence and to have been invited. I'm going to read a couple stories here. The first one is called Nebraska, and the origins of it were that Prairie Schooner, which is out of the University of Nebraska, knew that I was from Nebraska originally, and they asked me if I had a short story about Nebraska that I could contribute. I said, sure, but I had no story. And so I just decided to free associate, just move from one thing to another, just like the poets get away with sometimes. And this is the outcome. And some of these things I'm talking about, of course, are autobiographical of my growing up in the 50s and 60s primarily, but some are totally made up. The town is Americus, Covenant, Denmark, Grange, Hooray, Jerusalem, Sweetwater. One of the lesser-known moons of the Platte, conceived in sickness and misery by European pioneers who took the path of least resistance and put down roots in an emptiness like the one they kept secret in their youth. In Swedish and Danish and German and Polish, in anxiety and fury in God's providence, they chopped at the Great Plains with spades, creating green sod houses that crumbled and collapsed in the rain and disappeared in the first persuasive snow, and were so low the grown-ups stooped to go inside, and yet were places of ownership and a hard kind of happiness, the places that their occupants gravely stood before on those plenary occasions when photographs were taken. And then the Union Pacific stopped by, just a camp of white campaign tents and a boy playing his harpoon at night. And then a supply store, a depot, a pine water tank, stockyards, and the mean prosperity of the 20th century. The trains strolling into town to shed a boxcar in the depot's side yard, or crying past at 60 miles per hour, possibly interrupting a girl in her high wire act. Her arms looping up when she tips to one side, the rail top as slippery as a silver spoon. And then the yellow and red locomotive rises up from the heat shimmer over a mile away, the August noonday warping the side of it, but cinders tapping away from the spikes and the iron rails already vibrating up inside the girl's shoes. She steps down to the roadbed and then into high weeds as the Union Pacific pulls Wyoming coal and Georgia Pacific lumber and snowplow blades and aslant Japanese pickup trucks through the open countryside and on to Omaha. And when it passes by, a worker she knows is opposite her, like a pedestrian at a stoplight, the sun not letting up, the plain song of grasshoppers going on and on between them until the worker says, hot. Twice the Union Pacific tracks cross over the sidewinding Democrat, the water slow as an ox cart, green as silage, croplands to the east, yards and houses to the west, a green ceiling of leaves in some places, whirlpools showing up in it like spinning plates that lose speed and disappear. In winter and a week or more of just above zero, high school couples walk the gray ice, kicking up snow as quiet words are passed between them. Opinions are mildly compromised, sorrows are apportioned. And Emil Jedlicka unslings his blue-stocked .22 and slogs through high brown weeds and snow, hunting ring-necked pheasant, sidelong rabbits, and, always suddenly, quail, as his little brother Orrin sprints across the Democrat in order to slide like an otter. July in town is a gray highway and a Ford hay truck spraying by, hay sailing like a yellow ribbon caught in the mouth of a prancing dog. And Billy Awalt up there on the camel's hump, 18 years old and sweaty and dirty, peppered and dappled with hay dust, a lump of chew like an extra thumb under his lower lip, his blue eyes happening on a Dairy Queen, and a pretty girl licking a pale trickle of ice cream from the cone. And Billy slaps his heart and cries, "Oh, I am pierced." And late October is orange on the ground and blue overhead and grain silos stacked up like white poker chips, and a high silver water tower belittled one night by the sloppy tattoo of 1 year's class at George W. Norris High. And below the silos and water tower are stripped treetops, their gray limbs still lifted up in Alleluia, their yellow leaves crowding along yard fences and sheeping along the sidewalks and alleys under the shepherding wind. Or January, and a heavy snow partitioning the landscape, whiting out the highways and woods and cattle lots until there are only open spaces and steamed up window panes, and a Nordstrom boy limping pitifully in the hard plaster of his clothes, the snow as deep as his hips when the boy tips over and cannot get up, until a little Schumacher girl, sitting by the stoop window, a spoon in her mouth, a bowl of Cheerios in her lap, says in plain voice, "There's a boy," and her mother looks out to the sidewalk. Houses are big and white and 2 stories high, each a cousin to the next, with pigeon roosts in the attic gables, green storm windows in the upper floor, and a green-screened porch, some as pillowed and couched as parlors, or made into sleeping rooms for the boy whose next step will be the Navy, and days spent on a ship with his hometown's own population, on gray water that rises up and is allayed like a geography of cornfields, sugar beets, soybeans, wheat, that stays there and says in its own way, "Stay." Houses are turned away from the land and toward whatever is not always, sitting across from each other like dressed-up children at a party in daylight, their parents looking on with hopes and fond expectations. Overgrown elm and sycamore trees poach the sunlight from the lawns and keep petticoats of snow around them into April. In the deep lots out back are wire clotheslines with flapping white sheets pinned to them. Property lines are hedged with sour green and purple grapes, or with rabbit wire and gardens of peonies, roses, gladiola, irises, marigolds, pansies. Fruit trees are so closely planted that they cannot sway without knitting. The apples and cherries drop and sweetly decompose until there are only slight brown bumps in the yards. But the pears stay up in the wind, drooping under the pecks of birds, withering down like peppers until their sorrow is justly noticed and they one day disappear. Lined against an alley of blue shale rock is a garage whose doors slash weeds and scrape up pebbles as an old man pokily swings them open, teetering with his last weak push. And then Victor Johnson rummages inside, being cautious about his gray sweater and high-top shoes, looking over paint cans, junked electric motors, grass rakes and garden rakes, and a pitchfork and sickles, gray doors and ladders piled overhead in the rafters, and an old wind-up Victrola and heavy platter records from the 20s. On one of them, a soprano singing, "I'm a Lonesome Melody." Under a green tarpaulin is a wooden movie projector he painted silver and big cans of tan celluloid, much of it orange and green with age, but one strip of it preserved, of an army pilot in Jodhpurs, hopping from one biplane wing onto another's upper wing. Country people who'd paid to see the movie had been spellbound by the slight dip of the wings at the pilot's jump, the slap of his leather jacket, and how his hair strayed wild and was promptly sleeked back by the wind. But looking at the strip now, pulling a ribbon of it up to the window pane and letting it spool to the ground, Victor can make out only 20 frames of the leap, and then snapshot after snapshot of an army pilot clinging to the biplane's wing. And yet Victor stays with it, as though that scene of one man staying alive were what he'd paid his nickel for. Main Street is just a block away. Pickup trucks stop in it so their drivers can angle out over their brown left arms and speak about crops or praise the weather or make up sentences whose only real point is their lack of complication. And then a cattle truck comes by, and they mosey along with a touch of their cat bills or a slap of the door metal. High school girls in skin-tight jeans stay in one place on weekends, and jacked-up cars cruise past, rowdy farm boys overlapping inside, pulling over now and then in order to give the girls cigarettes and sips of pop and grief about their lipstick. And when the cars peel out, the girls say how a particular boy measured up, or they swap gossip about Donna Moriarty and the scope she permitted Randy when he came back from boot camp. Everyone is famous in this town, and everyone is necessary. Townspeople go to the Vaughan grocery store for the daily news, and to the home restaurant for history class, especially at evensong, when the old people eat graveled pot roast and lemon meringue pie and calmly sip coffee from cups they tip to their mouths with both hands. The Kiwanis Club meets here on Tuesday nights, and hopes are made public. Petty sins are tidily dispatched. The proceeds from the gumball machines are tallied up and poured into the upkeep of a playground. Utzler's Hardware has picnic items and kitchen appliances in its one window, in the manner of those prosperous men who would prefer to be known for their hobbies. And there is one crisp white Protestant church with a steeple of the sort pictured on calendars, and the Immaculate Conception Catholic Church grayly holding the town at bay like a Gothic wolfhound. And there is an insurance agency, a county coroner, a justice of the peace, a second-hand shop, a handsome chiropractor named Cook, who coaches the Pony League baseball team, a post office approached on unpainted wood steps outside of a cheap mobile home, the Nighthawk Tavern, where there's Falstaff tap beer, a green pool table, a poster recording the Cornhusker scores, a crazy man patiently tolerated, a gray-haired woman with an unmoored eye, a boy in spectacles thick as paperweights, a carpenter missing one index finger, a plump waitress whose day job is in a basement beauty shop, an old woman who creeps up to the side door at 8 in order to purchase one shot glass of whiskey. And yet, passing by and paying attention, an outsider is only aware of what isn't, that there's no bookshop, no picture show, no pharmacy or dry cleaners, no cocktail parties, extreme opinions, jewelry or piano stores, motels, hotels, hospital, political headquarters, philosophical theories about being and the soul. High importance is only attached to practicalities. And so there is the bachelor funeral home, where a proud old gentleman is on display in a dark brown suit, his yellow fingernails finally clean, his smeared eyeglasses in his coat pocket, a grandchild in tiptoes by the casket, peering at the lips that will not move, the sparrow chest that will not rise. And there's Tommy Seymour's for Sinclair gasoline and mechanical repairs, a green balloon dinosaur bobbing from a string over the cash register, old tires piled beneath the cottonwood, for sale in the side yard a Case tractor, a John Deere reaper, a hay mower, a red manure spreader, and a rusty grain conveyor, green weeds overcoming them, standing up inside them, trying slyly and little by little to inherit machinery for the earth. And beyond that are woods, a slope of pasture, 6 empty cattle pens, a driveway made of limestone pebbles, and the house where Alice Sorensen pages through a child's World Book Encyclopedia, stopping at the descriptions of California, Cape Town, Ceylon, Colorado, Copenhagen, Corpus Christi, Costa Rica, Cyprus. Widow Doric has been watering the lawn in an open raincoat and apron, but at 9 she walks the green hose around to the spigot and screws down the nozzle so that the spray is a misty crystal bowl, softly baptizing the ivy. She says, "How about some chamomile tea?" And she says, "Yum, oh boy, that hits the spot," and bends to shut the water off. The Union Pacific night train rolls through town just after 10 o'clock, when a 60-year-old man named Adolph Schooley is a boy again in bed, and when the huge weight of 40 or 50 cars jostles his upstairs room like a motor he'd put a quarter in. And over the sighing industry of the train, he can hear the train saying, "Nebraska, Nebraska, Nebraska, Nebraska," and he cannot sleep. Mrs. Antoinette Heft is at the home restaurant, placing frozen meat patties in waxed paper, pausing at times to clamp her fingers under her arms and press the sting from them. She stops when the Union Pacific passes, then picks a cigarette out of a pack of Cools and smokes it on the back porch, smelling air as crisp as Oxidol, looking up at stars the Pawnee Indians looked at, hearing the low harmonica of big rigs on the highway, in the town she knows like the palm of her hand, in the country she knows by heart. I had a weird experience with that. I was published by Prairie Schooner, and then a friend of mine said, "I saw your story in Harper's." And I said, "No, I'm not in Harper's." And he says, "Yeah, I'm pretty sure." I said, "No, you saw Prairie Schooner." So I look at Harper's, and there's my story in there. So I call up the Prairie Schooner and say, "How'd this show up there?" She says, "Oh, we were so proud. We got $75 for that story." And I said, "They pay $1,000 for a short story." And pretty soon the woman started crying, and I had to let her go. But they gave me an award in exchange for the loss of money. This next story is based on being in a blizzard. I'm sure a lot of you have had that experience around here. And I was working out in Columbus, Nebraska, in my brother-in-law's business, and I saw or heard the news that there was going to be a big blizzard coming. I looked in the refrigerator, there was no food there. So I decided it's time for me to go back to Omaha, where I had a lawyer friend who allowed me to use his attic room. And it just so happened we were dating sisters. And the blizzard came in earnest. And we walked on the biggest street in Omaha, Dodge Street, and we were right in the middle of it. There were no cars whatsoever. It was just white everywhere. And we got down to the sister's house, and we went inside. We had a great party. And the next morning, I saw this news in the paper about all these people who died. Cars were found on top of other cars. People who had their entire livestock wiped out. And I realized I was having a great time, and all these people were suffering. And so I saw the advertisement for a book called The Blizzard of 1888. It's called In All Its Fury. And it was about the blizzard of 1888. And so this is based on reminiscences of people who were in that blizzard of 1888, but were thinking about it in 1932, I believe. And so they put all their reminiscences together. And so I went through the book and just picked out what I thought were my favorite stories. All the people's names in here are actually in the index, but the first name and the last names are different for everybody. But I'm not going to read the whole story because it's rather long. Wickedness. At the end of the 19th century, a girl from Delaware got on a milk train in Omaha and took a green wool seat in a second-class car. August was outside the window, and sunlight was a yellow glare on the trees. Up front, a railway conductor in a navy blue uniform was gingerly backing down the aisle with a heavy package in a gunny sack that a boy was helping him with. They were talking about an agreeable seat away from the hot Nebraska day that was persistent outside. And then they were setting their cargo across the rendered aisle from the girl and tilting it against the shellacked wooden wall of the railway car before walking back up the aisle and elsewhere into August. She was 16 years old and an Easterner just recently hired as a county school teacher. But she knew enough about prairie farming to think the heavy package was a crank and piston washing machine or a boxed plowshare and coulter, something no higher than the bloody stump where the poultry were chopped with a hatchet and then wildly high-stepped around the yard. Soon, however, there was a juggling movement and the gunny sack slipped aside, and she saw an old man sitting there, his limbs hacked away, and dark holes where his ears ought to have been, the skin pursed at his jaw hinge like pink lips in a kiss. The milk train jerked into a roll through the railway yard, and the old man was jounced so that his gray cheek pressed against the hot window glass. Although he didn't complain, it seemed an uneasy position, and the girl wished she had the courage to get up from her seat and tug the jolting body upright. She instead got to her page in Quo Vadis and pretended to be so rapt by the book that she didn't look up again until Columbus, where a doctor with licorice on his breath sat heavily beside her and openly stared at his newspaper before whispering that the poor man was a carpenter in Genoa who'd been caught up in the great blizzard of 1888. Had she heard of that one? The girl shook her head. She ought to look out for their winters, the doctor said. Weather in Nebraska could be the wickedest thing she ever saw. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. And at Genoa, a young teamster got on in order to carry out the old man, whose half body was heavy enough that the boy had to yank the gunny sack up the aisle like 60 pounds of mail. In the year 1888, on the 12th day of January, a pink sun was up just after 7, and southeastern zephyrs of such soft temperature were sailing over the Great Plains that squatters walked their properties in high rubber boots and April jackets, and some farmhands took off their Civil War greatcoats to rake silage into the cattle troughs. However, sheep that ate whatever they could the night before raised their heads away from food and sniffed the salt tang in the air. And all that morning, streetcar mules were reported to be acting up, nipping each other, jingling hitch rings, foolishly waggling their dark manes and necks as though beset by gnats and horseflies. A Danish cattleman named Axel Hansen later said he was near the Snake River and tipping a teaspoon of saleratus into a yearling's mouth when he heard a faint groaning in the air in the north that was like the noise of a high waterfall at a fair distance. And Axel looked toward Dakota, and there half the sky was suddenly gray and black and indigo blue, with great storm clouds that were seething up as high as the sun and wrangling toward him at horse speed. Weeds were being uprooted, sapling trees were bullwhipping, and the top inches of snow and prairie soil were being sucked up and stirred like the dirty flour that was called Red Dog. And then the onslaught hit him hard as furniture, flying him onto his back so that when Axel looked up, he seemed to be undersea and in ice house cold. Eddying snow made it hard to breathe any way but sideways, and getting up to just his knees and hands seemed a great attainment. Although his sod house was but a quarter mile away, it took Axel 4 hours to get there. Half his face was frozen gray and hard as weatherboarding, so that the cattleman was speechless until nightfall. And then Axel Hansen simply told his wife that was not pleasant. Cowtails stuck out sideways when the wind caught them. Sparrows and crows whumped hard against the window panes, their jerking eyes seeking out an escape, their wings fanned out and flattened as though pinned up in an ornithologist's display. Cats died, dogs died, pigeons died. Entire farms of cattle and pigs and geese and chicken were wiped out in a single night. Horizontal snow that was hard and dry as salt dashed and seethed over everything, sloped up like rooftops, tricked its way across creek beds and ditches, milkily purled down city streets, stole shanties and coops and pens from a bleak landscape that even then was called the Great American Desert. Everything about the blizzard seemed to have personality and hateful intention, especially the cold. At 6 a.m., the temperature at Valentine, Nebraska was 30 degrees above zero. Half a day later, the temperature was 14 below, a drop of 44 degrees, and the difference between having toes and not, between staying alive overnight and not, between ordinary concerns and an overriding idea. Ansley Klassen was hopelessly lost in the whiteness and tilting low under the jamming gale when his right elbow jarred against a joist of a pigsty. He walked around the sty by skating his sore red hands along the upright shiplap, and then squeezed inside through the slop's trough. The pigs scampered over to him, seeking his protection, and Ainsley put himself among them, getting down in their stink and their body heat, sucking them away only when they ganged up or when 2 or 3 presumed he was food. Hurt was nailing into his finger joints until he thought to work his hands into the pig's hot wastes, then smeared some onto his skin. The pigs grunted around him and intelligently snuffled at his body with their pink and tender noses. And Ainsley thought, "You are not me, but I am you." And Ainsley Klassen got through the night without shame or injury. Whereas a Hartington woman took 2 steps out her door and disappeared into the snow until the snow sank away in April and raised her body up from her garden patch. An Omaha cigar maker got off the Leavenworth Street trolley that night, 50 yards away from his own home and 5 yards from another's. The completeness of the blizzard so puzzled him that the cigar maker tramped up and down the block more than 20 times and then slept against a lap post and died. A cattle inspector froze to death getting up on his quarter horse. The next morning he was still tilting the saddle with his upright weight, one cowboy boot just inside the iced stirrup, one bare paw mitten over the horn and reins. His quarter horse apparently kept waiting for him to complete his mount, and then the quarter horse died too. The Chicago boy, visiting his brother for the holidays, was going to a neighbor's farm to borrow a scoop shovel when the night train blizzard raged in and overwhelmed him. His tracks showed the boy mistakenly slanted past the sod house he'd just come from, and then tilted forward with perhaps the vain hope of running into some shop or shed or railway depot. His body was found 4 days later and 27 miles from home. A 40-year-old wife sought out her husband in the open range land near O'Neill, and days later was found standing up in her muskrat coat and black bandana, her scarf-wrapped hands tightly clenching the top strand of rabbit wire that was keeping her upright, her blue eyes still open but cloudily bottled by a half-inch of ice, her jaw unhinged as though she died yelling out a name. The 1 a.m. report from the chief signal officer in Washington, D.C. had said Kansas and Nebraska could expect, quote, fair weather followed by snow. Brisk to high southerly winds gradually diminishing in force, becoming westerly and warmer, followed by colder. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. On Friday the 13th, some pioneers went to the upper stories of their houses to jack up the windows and crawl out onto snow that was like a jeweled ceiling over their properties. Everything was sloped and planed and capped and whitely furbeloed. One man couldn't get over his boyish delight in tramping about on deer-hide snowshoes at the height of his roof gutters, or that his dogwood tree was forgotten but for twigs sticking out of the snow like skeleton figures. His name was Eldad Alderman, and he jammed a bamboo fishing pole in 4 likely spots a couple of feet below his snowshoes before the bamboo finally thumped against the plank roof of his chicken coop. He spent 2 hours spading down to the coop and then squeezed in through the one window in order to walk among the fowl and count up. Half his 60 hens were alive. The other half were still nesting, their orange beaks lying against their white hackles, sitting there like dress shops hats, their pure white eggs not yet cold underneath them. In gratitude to those 30 chickens that withstood the ordeal, Eldad gave them Dutch whey and curds and eventually wrote a letter praising their constitutions in the American poultry yard. Anna Shevchenko managed to get an oxen inside a shelter sturdily constructed of oak scantling and a high stack of barley straw. But the snow powder was so fine and fiercely penetrating that it sifted through and slowly accumulated on the floor. The oxen tamped it down and inchingly rose toward the plank scantling rafters, where they were stopped as the snow flooded up, and by daybreak were overcome and finally asphyxiated. Widow Shevchenko decided then that an old woman could not keep a Nebraska farm alone, and she left for the East in February. One man lost 300 Rhode Island red chickens. Another lost 260 Hereford cattle and sold their hides for $2 apiece. Hours after the Ubenka boy permitted 21 hogs to get out of the snowstorm and join their 40 Holsteins in the upper barn, the plank floor and the cattle little collapsed under the extra weight and the livestock perished. Since even coal picks could no more than chip the earth, the iron-hard bodies were hauled aside until they could be put underground in April. And just about then, some Pawnee Indians showed up outside David City. Knowing their manner of living, Mr. Ubenka told them where the carcass was rotting in the sea rack of weed tangles and thaw-water jetsam, and the Pawnee rode their ponies onto the property one night and hauled the carrion away. And there were stories about a Union Pacific train being arrested by snow on a railway siding near Lincoln, and the merchandisers in the smoking car playing euchre, high-five, and flinch until sunup. About cowboys staying inside a hazard bunkhouse for 3 days and getting belly aches from eating so many tins of anchovies and saltine crackers. About the Omaha YMCA, where shop clerks paged through inspirational pamphlets, or played checkers and cribbage, or napped in green leather Chesterfield chairs until the great blizzard petered out. Half a century later, in Atkinson, there was a cranky talker named Bates, who maintained he was the fellow who first thought of attaching the word blizzard to the onslaught of high winds and slashing dry snow, and ought to be given credit for it. And later, too, a Lincoln woman remembered herself as a little girl peering out through yellowed window paper at a yard and countryside that were as white as the first day of God's creation. And then a great white Brahma bull with street-wide horns trotted up to the house, the night snow puffing up from his heavy footsteps like soap flakes, gray funnels of air flaring from his nostrils and wisping away in the horrible cold. With a tilt of his head, the great bull sought out the hiding girl under a Chesterfield table, and having seen her, sighed and trotted back toward Oklahoma. Wild turkey were sighted over the next few weeks, their wattled heads and necks just above the snow like dark sticks, some of them petrified that way, but others simply waiting for happier times to come. The onslaught also killed prairie dogs, jackrabbits, and crows, and the coyotes that relied upon them for food got so hungry that skulks of them would loiter like juveniles in the yards at night and yearn for scraps and castaways in old songs of agony that are always misunderstood. That's not how it ends, but that's enough. Now this is for something completely different. This is kind of a found story. It actually happened to my late father-in-law, who was a lawyer down in the Pasadena area. And my wife is a character in this. It's called My Kid's Dog. My kid's dog died. Sparky. I hated that dog. The feeling was mutual. We got off on the wrong foot, whining in his pen those first nights, my squirt gun in his face and him blinking from the water. And then the holes in the yard, the so-called accidents in the house. His nose snuffling into my Brooks Brothers trousers, him slurping my fine Pilsner beer or sneaking bites of my Dagwood sandwich when I fell asleep on the sofa. Also, his inability to fetch, to take a joke, to find the humor in sudden air horns, to be dandled, roughhoused, or teased, and then the growling, the skulking, the snapping at my ankles, the hiding from me under the house, and literally thousands of abject refusals to obey, like, "Who the hell are you?" You'd have thought he was a cat. When pushed to the brink, I shouted, "I'll cut your face off and show it to you." And a small-brained mammal just stared at me. But with the kids or my wife, little Foo-Foo was a changeling, conning them with the tail, the prance, the peppiness, the soft chocolate brown eyes, the sloppy expressions of love, the easy tricks that if I performed, I get no credit for. Oh, we understood each other all right. I was on to him. And then at age 10 and none too soon, he kicked the bucket. You'd think that was be the end of it, end of story. But no, had to get even. Those who have tears prepare to shed them. I was futzing with the hinges on the front yard gate on a Saturday afternoon, my tattersall shirt sleeves rolled up, and my mind off in Oklahoma, when I noticed Fido in the California shade, snoozing, but for once a little wistful too, and far more serene than he usually was in my offensive presence. I tried to surprise him with my standard patriarchal shout, but it was no go. So I walked over and prodded the little guy with my wingtip, nothing doing, and not so much as a flutter in his oddly abstracted face. Surely this was the big sleep, I thought. She who must be obeyed was at the mall provisioning, so I was safe from objection or inquiry on that account. I then made an inventory of my progeny, Buzz in the collegiate East in the realm of heart attack tuitions, Zach in the netherworld of the surf shop, Susie, my last kid, on her bike and somewhere with her cousin. Were I to bury Rover with due haste and dispatch, I could forestall the waterworks, even convince them that he'd signed up with the circus, run afoul of Cruella de Vil, anything but died. I got a green tarpaulin from the garage and laid it out on the front yard while I hesitated before using my shoe to roll Spot into his funeral shroud, then dragged him back into the Victory Garden where August dying zucchini plants were in riot. With trusty spade, I dug his burial place, heaped earth atop him, tamped it down with satisfying whumps. I was feeling good about myself, heroic, as if miraculously compassion and charity had invaded not only my bones, but my soft muscle tissues. I fixed myself a tall glass of gin and tonic and watched the first quarter of the USC football game. And then pangs of conscience assailed me. Hadn't my investigation of said demise of Precious been rather cursory? Wouldn't I, myself, closely cross-examine a suspect whose emotions were clouded, whose nefarious wishes were well established, whose veterinary skills were without credential? The innocence of my childhood had been spoiled with tales of Edgar Allan Poe, so it was not difficult to conjure images of Scruffy clawing through tarpaulin and earth as he fought for one last gasp of air that others could more profitably use. I trudged out to the garden with aforementioned spade, and with great lumbar strain exhumed our darling lapdog. Considering the circumstances, he seemed none the worse for wear, but I did detect a marked disinclination to respirate, which I took as a sign either of his inveterate stubbornness or of his having reached the Stygian shore. The latter seemed more likely. I heard in my fuddled head a line from the Wild Bunch when a critically injured gunman begs his outlaw gang to finish it. And in the healing spirit of Hippocrates, I lifted high the shovel and wanged it down on Harvey's head. To my relief, not a whimper issued from him. I was confident he was defunct. With care, I shrouded and buried him again, committing earth to earth and dust to dust and so on. And with sprite-like step, conveyed myself to the kitchen, where I made another gin and tonic, and in semi-prone position, settled into the game's third quarter, the fabled Trojan running to attack, grinding out, it would seem, another win. I was shocked awake by the impertinence of a ringing telephone, which I, with due caution, answered. It was my wife's friend, Vicky, inquiring about the pooch, for it was her assertion that Snip had fancied a taste of her son's upper calf, and without invitation or permission to do so, had partaken of same within the last 24 hours. Even while I was wondering what toxicity lurked in the child's leg, and to what extent the poison was culpably responsible for our adored pet's actionable extinction, a loss we would feel for our lifetimes, Vicky insisted that I have the dog checked out by a vet to ascertain if he had rabies. Cause of death, rabies? It seemed unlikely. Notwithstanding his surliness, there had been no Kojo-esque frothing or lunging at car windows. But my familiarity with torts has made me both careful and rather unctuous with the plaintiff, and so I assured my wife's friend that I would accede to her request. Off to the backyard again. My pace that of a woebegone trudge, and with aforementioned implement of agriculture, I displaced the slack and loosened earth. This was getting old. With an accusatory tone, I said, "You're doing this on purpose, aren't you?" And I took his silence as a plea of nolo contendere. My plan, of course, was to employ the Oldsmobile 88 to transport my burden to the canine's autopsy at Dr. Romo's office just a half mile away. However, upon my settling into his plush front seat, it came to my attention that Zach, he who is but a sojourner on this earth, had not thought to replenish the fuel he'd used up on his trip to the Hollywood Bowl last night. The vehicle was not in a condition of plenitude, would not ferry us farther than a block. With Buster lying in the altogether on the driveway, not yet unsightly, but no calendar page, I went into the house and found an old leather suitcase in the attic, then stuffed the mutt into the larger flap compartment before hefting Shortcake and his final journey to those veterinary rooms he'd always shivered in. I am, as I may have implied, a man of depth, perspicacity, and nearly Olympian strength. But I found myself hauling my heavy and lifeless cargo to Dr. Romo's with a pronounced lack of vigor and resolve. The September afternoon was hot, the Pasadena streets were vacant, the entire world seemed to have found entertainment and surcease in ways that I had not. I was, in a word, in a sweaty snit, and after many panting and pain-filled stops, my spine in Quasimodo configuration, and my right arm gradually inching longer than my left, it was all I could do not to heave the suitcase containing Wonder Dog into a hallway behind the Chinese restaurant. But during our joint ordeal, I had developed a grudging affection for our pet, he who'd been so quick to defend my kith and kin against the noise of passing trucks, who took loud notice of the squirrels outside, who held fast in the foyer, hackles raised, fearlessly barking whenever company arrived at the front door. With him I seemed calm, masterful, and uneccentric, the superior man that the I Ching talks so much about. Without him, I thought, I might be otherwise. I put down the suitcase to shake the ache from my fingers and subtract affliction from my back. And it was then that my final indignity came. An angel of mercy spied my plight, braked his ancient Cadillac, and got out, his facial piercings and tattoos and shoot the marble's eyes, belying the kindness and decency of his heart, as he asked, "Can I help you with that suitcase?" "I can handle it." "Are you sure?" "I'm just 2 blocks away." "What the heck's in it?" he asked. And for some reason I said, "A family heirloom." "Wow," he said. "Why don't you put it in my trunk and I'll help you with it? I got nothing better to do." Well, it did not just fall off the turnip truck. I would have been, in other circumstances, suspicious, but I was all too aware of the weight and worthlessness of my cumbrance, and so I granted his specified offer, hoisting the deceased into the Seville and slamming down the trunk lid. And in evidence of our fallen state, my Samaritan immediately took off without me, jeering and peeling rubber and speeding west toward Los Angeles. I could only lift my hand in a languid wave. So long, old sport. Our world being the location of penance and recrimination, it was only right that my last kid should pedal up to me on her bike just then and ask, "Daddy, what are you doing here?" Waving to a fellow in need of a shovel, I thought. And then I confessed, Sparky's sudden death, the burial, not the exhumation and execution attempt, but the imputation of rabies and my arduous efforts to acquit his reputation with the pilgrimage to the vets. Susie took it all in with sang-froid for a little while, but then the lip quivered and tears spilled down her gorgeous eyes. And as I held her close, she begged me to get her another dog, just like Sparky. And that was Sparky's final revenge, for I said, "Okay, honey, another dog, just like him." Thank you very much. And then it's customary to have questions and answers.
Yes, we do have about 5 or 10 minutes for a few questions. If anyone would like to ask Mr. Hansen a question, just raise your hand and then I'll bring you the mic so that those on the video will be able to hear the question.
So did your father-in-law tell you something of that story, or was it your wife that told you that story?
Yeah, he confessed it to my wife and my brother-in-law shortly before his death, actually. But he didn't tell it as a comic story. For him, it was very grim. But even when my brother-in-law was telling the story, he couldn't help but grin. So I decided to do it that way.
Where do you get your ideas for your books? And are you an outliner, plan it all out ahead of time, or write as you go along?
Sometimes I hear stories, sometimes I read biographies and come up with unusual details. I'm always looking for story ideas. And I trust my memory. I don't write things down. I think that the memory is a good editor, and if it's really important, you'll keep it. If it's not, you'll let it go. I am an outliner. I usually know where I'm going. My teacher at Iowa was John Irving, and he actually has to know the first sentence and the last sentence of a novel before he begins it. So he's an outliner too, and maybe that's where I picked it up. But what is nice about an outline is it saves you a lot of time. Because you don't write 60 pages and realize they don't belong there.
Do you have a favorite book you've written?
It's probably Mariette and Ecstasy, and it's simply because I didn't think it was going to get published. And it did. And I showed it, I have a good friend, Jim Shepard, he reads all my manuscripts, and when I sent him the last draft, he says, "I think you got a 60% chance of getting this published." And 60 seemed okay. Then I did well. So you're kind of proud of those. But they're all fun. You know, in fact, like a family with lots of children, you don't want to have just one single out. You kind of love them both in different ways, or all of them. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
I was wondering what your writing process is like for descriptions, because you use a lot of very evocative imagery and interesting metaphors. Like, you talked about the tobacco being like an extra thumb, and the nesting chickens being like dress hats. And I just wondered if those images sort of just come to you, or if you have a process of sort of dwelling on images that you want to create.
I think more than most writers, I have a cinema of the mind when I'm writing. So I'm actually seeing the pictures I'm describing. And so then I just try to make it more precise. And usually that's done with metaphor. But I think the reason I think a lot of my stuff has been picked up from movies is because I've already seen it as a movie. Other people have ears and I have eyes. Yeah.
Thank you. Most authors tend to focus on a particular form, genre, and stay in that lane. You have not. You've written short fiction, long fiction, screenplays, prose and nonfiction, and I'm just curious, do you find different satisfaction in all of that? What drives you so far afield? I'm one of the worst channel shifters ever. Not that I go to all of them, I stop at everything. And it could be a Korean television station or something, and I'm absorbed by it. So I think I just have a lot of interest in a lot of different subjects, and that keeps me energized. And whenever I pick on a topic to write about, I have to think about what is the voice that's telling us. And is this a John Cheever story? Is it a Ray Carver story? So I apply those things to keep myself interested.
Just out of curiosity, out of all your stories, which one gave you the most trouble that you just had problems with?
There's a story called True Romance I started it maybe when I was 20 years old, and finally got it sold when I was 36. And about every year I pick it up and redo it. So it's a weird story. I was charmed by it. It was sold to Esquire magazine finally, and Rust Hills, who was the fiction editor then, called me up and says, "I want this story, but I don't understand it." And I didn't try to explain it to him.
You've written several screenplays, and your Jesse James novel was made into a film. Do you ever find yourself writing a novel with the movie in mind, so that you end up kind of writing more minimally?
No. I have one novel that it was originally a screenplay, and I turned it into a novel because the screenplay didn't sell. And it's called Isn't It Romantic? And it's probably more minimal than a lot of my things. But most of the time I'm trying to make, as I said, the movie come alive so that a movie isn't necessary. But that's why books are often more satisfying than the movie is, because you're a co-creator with me. I'm describing one thing and you're seeing another, and it's whatever you're seeing is more lively to you, and that's what you always endeavor to have.
Did you ever have a defining moment that you decided you wanted to be a writer? What inspired you to be a writer?
Yeah, it's a weird defining moment. And I don't know why it happened, but I think I was in 7th or 8th grade, and we were assigned an essay on the crucifixion. And I put up my hand out of the blue and I said, "Can I write it as a short story?" And my teacher said, "Okay," because nobody else had asked her that. And so I wrote this story, and I realized I really loved writing fiction rather than essays, even though I write essays too. But that was it, that I got away with it. I think anybody who becomes a writer always thinks they're getting away with something. And that's why we can be so nervous about our work. When I send it off to an editor or an agent,
I think they're going to tell me it's terrible, and I'm going to agree with them because all I do is see the flaws in it. But luckily, that hasn't happened very often.
Well, would you join me in thanking our visiting writer, Ron Hansen, once again? We do have several of Mr. Hansen's novels for sale over there. Thank you to Jay Stroud and the OBU, the Tree of Life bookstore, for making those available. I will get Mr. Hansen situated over here at this table for signing books if you buy one and you'd like to sign it, or if you brought a copy and you'd like to sign it. Otherwise, I hope you will all please help eat all this wonderful food. So you're not allowed to leave without taking some food with you or eating it before you go. Thank you for being here.